Chapter 24 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Just one word of explanation before I begin to read. Dickens uses the word bespeak to indicate what some would call a benefit performance. In other words, the performance of a play, the proceeds of which are shared between the person whose bespeak it is and the management. You will remember, no doubt, that Nicholas had been given a commission by Mr. Crummles to translate a French play and adapt it into a suitable offering for the theatrical company to put before the public. And he had also himself been cast as Romeo in Romeo and Juliet at a future performance at which Smike was to take the part of the apothecary. But all that is to come. Nicholas was up betimes in the morning, but he had scarcely had time to dress, notwithstanding, when he heard footsteps ascending the stairs, and was presently saluted by the voices of Mr. Folair, the pantomimist, and Mr. Lenville, the tragedian. "House! House! House!" cried Mr. Folair.
"What ho within there?" said Mr. Lenville in a deep voice.
"Confound these fellows," thought Nicholas. "They've come to breakfast, I suppose. I'll open the door directly, if you'll wait an instant." The gentleman entreated him not to hurry himself, and, to beguile the interview, had a fencing bout with their walking sticks on a very small landing place, to the unspeakable discomposure of all the other lodgers downstairs. "Here, come in," said Nicholas, when he had completed his toilet. "In the name of all that's horrible, don't make that noise outside."
"An uncommon snug little box, this,"
said Mr. Lenville, stepping into the front room and taking off his hat before he could get in at all.
"Pernicious snug."
"For a man at all particular in such matters, it might be a trifle too snug," said Nicholas, "for although it is undoubtedly a great convenience to be able to reach anything you want from the ceiling or the floor or either side of the room without having to move from your chair, still these advantages can only be had in an apartment of the most limited size."
"It isn't a bit too confined for a single man," returned Mr. Lenville. "Oh, that reminds me. My wife, Mr. Johnson, I hope she'll have some good part in this play of yours."
"I glanced at the French copy last night," said Nicholas. "It looks very good, I think."
"What do you mean to do for me?"
asked Mr. Lenville, poking the struggling fire with his walking stick and afterwards wiping it on the skirt of his coat.
"Anything in the gruff and grumble way."
"You turn your wife and child out of doors," said Nicholas, "and in a fit of rage and jealousy you stab your eldest son in the library."
"Do I, though?" exclaimed Mr. Lenville. "That's very good business."
"And after which," said Nicholas, "you are troubled with remorse till the last act, and then you make up your mind to destroy yourself. But just as you are raising the pistol to your head, a clock strikes 10.
"I see," cried Mr. Lenville. "Very good."
"You pause," said Nicholas. "You recollect to have heard a clock strike 10 in your infancy. The pistol falls from your hand. You are overcome. You burst into tears. and become a virtuous and exemplary character for ever afterwards.
Capital, said Mr. Lenville. That's a sure card, a sure card. Get the curtain down with a touch of nature like that, and it'll be a triumphant success.
Is there anything good for me? Inquired Mr. Folair anxiously. Let me see, said Nicholas. You play the faithful and attached servant. You are turned out of doors with the wife and child. Always coupled with that infernal phenomenon, sighed Mr. Folair. And we go into poor lodgings, where I won't take any wages, and I talk sentiment, I suppose. Why, yes, replied Nicholas. That is the course of the play. I must have a dance of some kind, you know, said Mr. Folair. You'll have to introduce one for the phenomenon, so you'd better make it a pas de deux and save time.
There's nothing easier than that, said Mr. Lenville, observing the disturbed looks of the young dramatist.
Upon my word, I don't see how it's to be done, rejoined Nicholas.
Why, isn't it obvious?
Reasoned Mr. Lenville.
Gadzooks! Who can help seeing the way to do it? You astonish me. You get the distressed lady and the little child and the attached servant into the poor lodgings, don't you? Well, look here. The distressed lady sinks into a chair and buries her face in her pocket handkerchief. What makes you weep, mamma? Says the child. Don't weep, mamma, or you'll make me weep too. And me, says the faithful servant, rubbing his eyes with his arm. What can we do to raise your spirits, dear mamma? Says the child. Aye, what can we do? Says the faithful servant.
Oh, Pierre,
says the distressed lady. Would that I could shake off these painful thoughts. Try, ma'am, try, says the faithful servant. Rouse yourself, ma'am. Be amused. I will, says the lady. I will learn to suffer with fortitude. Do you remember that dance, my honest friend, which in happier days you practised with this sweet angel? It never failed to calm my spirits then. Oh, let me see it once again before I die. There it is. Cue for the band, Before I Die, and off they go. That's the regular thing, isn't it, Tommy?
That's it, replied Mr. Folair. The distressed lady, overpowered by old recollections, faints at the end of the dance, and you close in with a picture. Profiting by these and other lessons, which were the result of the personal experience of the two actors, Nicholas willingly gave them the best breakfast he could, and when he at length got rid of them, applied himself to his task, by no means displeased to find that it was so much easier than when he at first supposed. He worked very hard all day, and didn't leave his room until the evening, when he went down to the theatre, whither Smike had repaired before him to go on with another gentleman as a general rebellion, and to see the play which the company were presently performing. Here all the people were so much changed that he scarcely knew them. False hair, false colour, false calves, false muscles, blooming warrior of most exquisite proportions was Mr. Lenville. Mr. Crummles, his large face shaded by a profusion of black hair, was dressed as a Highland outlaw of most majestic bearing. One of the old gentlemen dressed as a jailer, the other a venerable patriarch. The comic countryman, a fighting man of great valour, relieved by a touch of humour. Each of the master Crummelses a prince in his own right, and the low-spirited lover a desponding captive. There was a gorgeous banquet ready spread for the third act, consisting of 2 pasteboard vases, 1 plate of biscuits, a black bottle, and a vinegar cruet. And in short, everything was on the scale of the most splendid and preparedness. Nicholas was standing with his back to the curtain, now contemplating the first scene, which was a Gothic archway about 2 feet shorter than Mr. Crummel's, through which that gentleman was to make his first entrance, and now listening to a couple of people who were cracking nuts in the gallery of the theatre, wondering whether they made the whole audience, when the manager himself walked up familiarly and accosted him.
"Been in front tonight?"
said Mr. Crummel's. No, replied Nicholas, not yet. I'm going to see the play.
"We've a pretty good let,"
said Mr. Crummel's.
4 front places in the centre, and the whole of the stage box.
Oh, indeed, said Nicholas. A family, I suppose.
Yes,
said Mr. Crummel's.
Yes, it's an affecting thing. There are 6 children, and they never come unless the phenomenon plays.
It would have been difficult for any party, family or otherwise, to have visited the theatre on a night when the phenomenon did not play, inasmuch as she always sustained 1, and not uncommonly 2 or 3 characters every night. But Nicholas, sympathising with the feelings of a father, refrained from hinting at this trifling circumstance, and Mr. Crummel's continued to talk uninterrupted by him.
Yes, 6,
said the gentleman.
Ma and Pa, 8, Aunt, 9, governess, 10, grandfather, grandmother, 12. Then there's the footman who stands outside with a bag of oranges and a jug of toast and water, and sees the play for nothing through the little pane of glass in the box door. It's cheap at a guinea. They gain a lot by taking a box.
I wonder you allow so many, observed Nicholas.
Oh, there's no help for it,
replied Mr. Crummel's.
It's always expected in the country. If there are 6 children, 6 people come to hold them in their laps. A family box carries double always. Ring the orchestra, Grodden.
That useful lady did as she was bid, and shortly afterwards the tuning of 3 fiddles was heard, which process, having been protracted as long as it was supposed that the patience of the audience could possibly bear it, was put a stop to by another jerk of the bell, which, being the signal to begin in earnest, set the orchestra playing a variety of popular airs with involuntary variations. If Nicholas had been astonished at the alterations for the better which the gentleman displayed, the transformation of the ladies was still more extraordinary. When, from a snug corner of the manager's box, he beheld Miss Snevellicci in all the glories of white muslin and a golden hem, and Mrs. Crummel's in all the dignity of the outlaw's wife, and Miss Bravassa in all the sweetness of Miss Snevellicci's confidential friend, and Miss Balvorni in the white silks of a page doing duty everywhere and swearing to live and die in the service of everybody, he could scarcely contain his admiration, which testifies itself in great applause and the closest possible attention to the business of the theme. The plot of the play was most interesting. It belonged to no particular age, people, or country, and was perhaps the more delightful on that account as nobody had previous information and could afford the remotest glimmering of whatever would come of it. An outlaw, having been very successful in doing something somewhere, had come home in triumph to the sound of shouts and fiddles to greet his wife, a lady of masculine mind, who talked a good deal about her father's bones, which it seemed, were unburied, though whether from a peculiar taste on the part of the old gentleman himself, or the reprehensible neglect of his relations, did not appear. The outlaw's wife was somehow or other mixed up with a patriarch living in a castle a long way off, and this patriarch was the father of several of the characters, but he didn't exactly knew which, and was uncertain whether he had brought up the right ones in his castle or the wrong ones. He rather inclined to the latter opinion, and being uneasy, relieved his mind with a banquet, during which solemnity somebody in a cloak said, "Beware!" which somebody was known by nobody except the audience to be the outlaw himself, who had come there for reasons unexplained, but possibly with an eye to the spoons. There was an agreeable little surprise in the way of certain love passages between the desponding captive and Miss Snevellicci, and the comic fighting man and Miss Bravassa, besides which Mr. Lenville had several very tragic scenes in the dark, while on throat-cutting expeditions, which were all baffled by the skill and bravery of the comic fighting man, who overheard whatever was said all through the piece, and the intrepidity of Miss Snevellicci, who adopted tights, and therein repaired to the prison of her captive lover with a small basket of refreshments and a dark lantern. At last it came out that the patriarch was the man who had treated the bones of the outlaw's father-in-law with so much disrespect, for which cause and reason the outlaw's wife repaired to his castle to kill him, and so got into a dark room where, after a good deal of groping in the dark, everybody got hold of everybody else and took them for somebody, besides which occasioned a vast quantity of confusion, with some pistoling, loss of life, and torchlight, after which the patriarch came forward, and observing with a knowing look that he knew all about his children now, and would tell them when they got inside, said that there could be no more propitious occasion for marrying the young people than that, and therefore he joined their hands, with the full consent of the indefatigable page, who, being the only person surviving, pointed with his cap to the clouds and his right hand to the ground, thereby invoking a blessing, and giving the cue for the curtain to come down, which it did amidst general applause. "What did you think of that?" said Mr. Crummles, when Nicholas went round to the stage again. Mr. Crummles was very red and hot, for your outlaws are desperate fellows to shout. I think it was very capital indeed," replied Nicholas. "Miss Snevellicci in particular was uncommonly good." "She's a genius," said Mr. Crummles, "quite a genius. By the by, I've been thinking of bringing out your piece on her bespeak night." "When?" asked Nicholas. "The night of her bespeak, her benefit night, when her friends and patrons bespeak the play," said Mr. Crummles. Oh, I understand," replied Nicholas. "You see," said Mr. Crummles, "it's sure to go on such an occasion, and even if it shouldn't work up quite as well as we expect, why, it'll be her risk, you know, not ours." "You mean yours?" said Nicholas. "I said mine, didn't I?" returned Mr. Crummles. "Next Monday week, what do you say? You'll have it done by then, and are sure to be up in the lover's part long before that time." "Well, I don't know about long before," replied Nicholas, "but by that time I think I can undertake to be ready."
"Very good,"
pursued Mr. Crummles.
"Then we'll call that settled. Now, I want to ask you about something else. There's a little, what shall we say, a little canvassing takes place on these occasions."
"Among the patrons, I suppose," said Nicholas.
"Yes, among the patrons. And the fact is that Snevellicci has had so many bespeaks in this place that she wants an attraction."
She had a bespeak when her mother-in-law died, and a bespeak when her uncle died, and Mrs. Crummles and myself had bespeaks on the anniversary of the phenomenon's birthday, and our wedding day, and occasions of that description, so that, in fact, there's some difficulty in getting a good one. Now, won't you help the poor girl, Mr. Johnson? Said Crummles, sitting himself down on a drum and taking a great pinch of snuff as he looked steadily in Nicholas's face.
How do you mean? Repeated Nicholas.
Don't you think you could spare half an hour tomorrow morning to call with her at the houses of one or two of the principal people? Murmured the manager in persuasive tones.
Oh, dear me, said Nicholas with an air of very strong objection. I shouldn't like to do that at all.
The infant will accompany her, said Mr. Crummles. The moment it was suggested to me, I gave permission for the infant to go. There will not be the smallest impropriety. Miss Snevellicci, sir, is the very soul of honour. It would be a material service. The gentleman from London, author of the new play, actor in the new piece, first appearance on any boards. It would lead to a great bespeak, Mr. Johnson.
I'm very sorry to throw a damp upon the prospects of anybody, and more especially a lady, replied Nicholas, but really I must decidedly object to making one of the canvassing party.
What does Mr. Johnson say, Vincent?
Inquired a voice close to his ear, and looking round he found Mrs. Crummles and Miss Snevellicci herself standing behind him.
He has some objections, my dear, replied Mr. Crummles, looking at Nicholas.
Objections?
Exclaimed Mrs. Crummles.
Can it be possible?
Oh, I hope not, cried Miss Snevellicci. You surely are not so cruel. Oh, dear me. Well, to think of it now, after all one's looking forward to it.
Mr. Johnson will not persist, my dear,
said Mrs. Crummles.
Think better of him than to suppose it. Gallantry, humanity, all the best feelings of his nature must be enlisted in this interesting cause.
Which moves even a manager, said Mr. Crummles, smiling.
And a manager's wife,
added Mrs. Crummles in her accustomed tragic tones.
Come, you will relent. I know you will.
It is not in my nature, said Nicholas, moved by these appeals, to resist any entreaty unless it is to do something positively wrong. And beyond a feeling of pride, I know nothing which should prevent my doing this. I know nobody here, nobody knows me. So be it then, I yield. Miss Snevellicci was at once overwhelmed with blushes and expressions of gratitude, of which latter commodity neither Mr. nor Mrs. Crummles were by any means sparing. It was arranged that Nicholas should call upon her at her lodgings at 11 the next morning. Soon afterwards they parted. He to return home to his authorship, Miss Snevellicci to dress for the afterpiece, and the disinterested manager and his wife to discuss the probable gains of the forthcoming bespeak, of which they were to have 2/3 of the profits by general agreement. It was a trying morning, for there were a great many calls to make, and everybody wanted a different thing. Some wanted tragedies and other comedies, some objected to dancing, Some wanted scarcely anything else. Some thought the comic singer decidedly low, and others hoped he would have more to do than he usually had. Some people wouldn't promise to go because other people wouldn't promise to go, and other people wouldn't go at all because other people went. At length, and by little and little, omitting something in this place and adding something in that, Miss Snevellicci pledged herself to a bill of fare which was comprehensive enough, if it had no other merit. It included, among other trifles, 4 pieces, divers songs, a few combats, and several dances. And so they returned home, pretty well exhausted with the business of the day. Nicholas worked all day at his play, which was speedily put into rehearsal, and then worked away at his own part, which he studied with great perseverance, and acted, as the whole company said, to perfection. And at length the great day arrived. The crier was sent round in the morning to proclaim the entertainments with sounds of bells in all the thoroughfares, and extra bills of 3 feet long by 9 inches wide were dispersed in all directions, flung down by all the areas, thrust under all the knockers, and developed in all the shops. They were placarded on all walls too, though not with complete success. For an illiterate person, having undertaken this office during the indisposition of the regular bill sticker, a part were posted sideways and the remainder upside down. At 5:30 there was a rush of 4 people at the gallery door. At 6:15 there were at least a dozen. At 6 o'clock the kicks at the door were terrific, and when the elder Master Crummles opened the door he was obliged to run behind it for his life. 15 shillings were taken by Mrs. Crutton in the first 10 minutes. Behind the scenes the same unwonted excitement prevailed. Miss Snevellicci was in such a perspiration that the paint would scarcely stay on her face. Mrs. Crummles was so nervous that she could hardly remember her part. Miss Bravassa's ringlets came out of curl with heat and anxiety. Even Mr. Crummles himself kept peeping through the hole in the curtain and running back every now and again to announce that there was somebody else come into the pit. At last the orchestra left off, and the curtain rose upon the new play. The first scene, in which there was nobody particular, passed off calmly enough, but when Miss Snevellicci went in at the second, accompanied by the phenomenon as a child, what a roar of applause broke out. The people in the boxes rose as one man, waving their hats and handkerchiefs and uttering shouts of "Bravo!" Mrs. Boreham and the governess cast wreaths upon the stage, of which some fluttered into the lamps, and one crowned the temples of a fat gentleman in the pit, who, looking eagerly towards the scene, remained unconscious of the honour. A tailor and his family kicked at the panels of the upper boxes till they threatened to come out altogether. A very ginger-headed boy remained transfixed in the centre of the house. A young officer, supposed to entertain a passion for Miss Snevellicci, stuck his glass in his eye as though to hide a tear. Again and again Miss Snevellicci curtsied lower and lower, and again the applause came down louder and louder. At length, when the phenomenon picked up one of the smoking wreaths and put it on sideways over Miss Snevellicci's eye, it reached its climax, and the play proceeded. But when Nicholas came on for his crack scene with Mrs. Crummles, what a clapping of hands there was! When Mrs. Crummles, who was his unworthy mother, sneered and called him a presumptuous boy, and he defied her, what a tumult of applause came on. When he quarrelled with the other gentleman about the young lady, and producing a case of pistols, said that if he was a gentleman he would fight him in that drawing-room until the furniture was sprinkled with the blood of one, if not two.
How the boxes, pit and gallery joined in one most vigorous cheer when he called his mother names, because she wouldn't give up the young lady's property, and she, relenting, caused him to relent likewise and fall down upon one knee and ask her blessing. How the ladies in the audience sobbed! When he was hid behind the curtain in the dark, and the wicked relation poked a sharp sword in every direction, save where his legs were plainly visible, what a thrill of anxious fear ran through the house! His air, his figure, his walk, his look, everything he said or did was the subject of commendation. There was a round of applause every time he spoke. And when at last, in the pump and tub scene, Mrs. Grudden lighted the blue fire, and all the unemployed members of the company came in and tumbled down in various directions, not because they had anything to do with the plot, but in order to finish off with a tableau, the audience, who had by this time increased considerably, gave vent to such a shout of enthusiasm as had not been heard in those walls for many and many a day. In short, the success of this new play and this new actor was complete, and when Miss Snevellicci was called for at the end of the play, Nicholas led her on and divided the applause.